The entire room burst into laughter when the man raised his glass and asked him outright how it felt to live off his wife. The laughter rang out bright under the crystal chandeliers, and the loudest laugh of all came from the woman standing beside him, his wife. The Ritz-Carlton Chicago that night looked like a stage dipped in gold. Light spilled over white tablecloths, polished silverware, and expensive suits worn by people accustomed to giving orders. This was the internal gala of Aurelia Capital, a place where conversations about profits investing and power flowed as easily as small talk. For them, it was familiar territory. For him, it was a room where he always stood half a step out of place. He stood straight-shoulders, squared a glass of unfinished whiskey in his hand. His suit was not the newest, not branded with any famous label, but it fit him perfectly. He did not smile. He did not react. He simply let the laughter wash over him like a cold wave. Each burst of laughter was a blade not stabbing outright, but cutting slowly and deeply into something called dignity. The man who had spoken was a senior manager, someone used to attention, used to testing other people's limits with jokes that hovered between humor and contempt. He glanced at him, eyes bright with satisfaction. The circle around them followed along. Some laughed because they found it funny. Others laughed because they did not want to be the odd one out. And his wife laughed because she believed it was the safest way to belong in this room. She stood there in an emerald gown that caught every shard of light, drawing every gaze. One perfectly manicured hand rested lightly on the arm of the man who had just mocked her husband. Not intimate enough to be named, but close enough to invite assumptions. Her smile was flawless, the kind worn by a rising star in the financial world. That smile had once been for him a long time ago. He took a sip of whiskey. The burn slid down his throat, mirroring the feeling tightening in his chest. This was who they thought he was, an unemployed husband, an early retiree, living on small investments, a decorative accessory to match his wife's success. They did not know, and for 15 years he had allowed them not to know. The manager was not finished. He tilted his head, raised his voice just enough for nearby tables to hear, asking what he did all day, while his wife closed deals and sat in board meetings. The laughter came again louder and more confident, as if they had found a harmless form of entertainment. He looked at his wife, and in that brief moment, he waited for something small, a flicker of discomfort, a shake of the head, a word to redirect the conversation. There was nothing, only the smile and the gentle squeeze of his arm, not to protect him, but to warn him not to complicate things. In his mind, years of silence stacked on top of each other, the dinners where he stood behind her, the stories she told about him carefully edited to fit the image she wanted. He had chosen silence, chosen to step back, not out of weakness, but because he wanted to believe love did not need titles or wealth to survive. But some lines are not spoken until someone crosses them without hesitation. He set his glass on the table. The movement was small, but enough to make the nearest people pause. He straightened, adjusted his tie, slow and deliberate. A few laughs faded as they sensed the shift, something in his posture that changed the air before anyone understood why. He looked directly at the man in the dark suit standing at the center of the group, the chief executive officer, the man celebrated all night, the man who believed everything in this room was under his control. His voice was not loud, but it was clear and heavy enough to land on the table, like solid metal. He said that position would only be enjoyed for the next 24 hours, because the man they had just called a loser would be the one signing his termination papers. The room went completely silent. The music seemed to fall away. Color drained from the faces of those who had been laughing moments before. His wife's hand slipped from his arm without her realizing it. In that moment, he knew there was no way back, and no reason to go back. Tonight they would remember this for a long time, and he was finally ready to remind them exactly who he was. He did not wait for anyone to react. The moment the room fell silent, he knew the impact had spread far enough. This was not the awkward pause after a failed joke. It was the heavy silence that comes when a familiar order has just been shattered. The eyes that had once passed over him like he was invisible now clung to him, confused, searching, unable to make sense of what they had just heard. The man standing at the center of the group, the chief executive officer who had been praised all night, still held his champagne glass suspended in mid-air. His throat moved, but no words came out. It was the reflex of someone who had never imagined losing control. The manager who had mocked him stood there with his mouth open as if trying to solve an equation that simply could not exist. And his wife, the woman who had laughed the loudest moments earlier, now stood frozen, her beautiful face locked in an expression he had never seen before. He did not need to say anything else. What he had just said was not an argument. It was not a threat. It was a notice. A sharp clinking sound cut through the stillness. The wineglass in his wife's trembling hand slipped free and shattered on the marble floor. Dark red liquid spread beneath her feet, soaking into the white linen like a stain that could not be hidden. The sound snapped something loose. Whispers erupted. Chairs shifted, heads leaned closer together as people tried to piece together what they had just witnessed. A room once ruled by order and hierarchy now felt like a hive that had been violently disturbed. He adjusted his jacket, the movement clean and almost cold. There was no burst of anger, no visible triumph, just a clear sensation in his chest, relief like shedding a heavy coat he had worn for far too many years. He stepped back from the table. No one stopped him. No one dared. The chief executive officer remained rooted in place, fingers tightening around the stem of his glass as if letting go would make the truth any more real. The manager turned toward him, stammering something in a low, urgent voice, but he did not listen. He had already turned away. The marble floor amplified each step he took, steady and deliberate. Every step was a period at the end of a sentence. Behind him he heard his name called out, his wife's voice, higher than usual, edged with panic. He did not look back. If they wanted answers, they would have to earn them. For 15 years, he had allowed other people to write his story. That was over. The heavy doors of the ballroom closed behind him, cutting off the remaining noise. The hotel hallway was quieter warm light, reflecting off polished stone walls. The sound of high heels followed him fast and uneven, now stripped of the confidence that usually marked her stride. She called his name again this time, without the flawless composure she had worn all night. When her hand caught his arm and spun him halfway around, he finally looked at her. The perfect makeup had begun to crack a loose strand of hair, slipping free from its careful twist. Her eyes searched his face, hoping to find a smile, a sign that everything was a joke. She demanded to know what it meant. Her voice belonged to someone who had just realized she had been standing on the wrong side of a truth far too big to ignore. He did not answer right away. He studied her, truly looked at her as if seeing the person in front of him for the first time, rather than the image she had always projected. He asked quietly whether she truly did not know, or whether she had simply never wanted to know. The question stopped her cold. In that moment she understood that the deepest pain was not that he had hidden something from her, but that she had so easily accepted a version of him that made her feel superior. She spoke about the 3 years she believed he had not worked. He repeated the word slowly, as if tasting it. Unemployed. A label she had used casually with friends, with colleagues, perhaps even with herself. He laughed, but there was no humor in it. He told her he had spent his life building something that did not need to be flaunted, and letting her believe whatever story made her feel safe in that room. She fell silent, not because she had nothing to say, but because for the first time she did not know where she stood in their marriage. The power she thought she held suddenly felt fragile. He took a step back, creating a distance he had never allowed before. He said the reason he spoke up was not because of the insults, but because of the moment she laughed along with them. After 15 years, she had not stood by him, not even once. She opened her mouth, but he turned away. This time not to escape, but to move forward. And behind him in that elegant hallway, a marriage began to crack, not because the truth had been spoken, but because it had been ignored for far too long. He drove away from the hotel in silence. The city at night slid past the windows like an old film reel, streetlights stretching into blurred lines. His hand stayed steady on the steering wheel, not shaking, not rushed. The rush of adrenaline faded, replaced by something colder and sharper. This was no longer an impulsive moment. This was the beginning. When he got home, he did not turn on the main lights. The glow from the kitchen was enough to guide his familiar steps. The house was quiet and orderly, just like the life he had lived for years. Family photos still sat on the shelves, smiles, carefully framed memories that had once been real. He did not touch them. He turned into his office, the room his wife liked to call the place where he wasted his days. He closed the door. The soft click of the lock sounded final. Behind the bookshelf, he pressed a hidden point. Only he knew. A panel slid aside, revealing a fireproof safe. There was no music, no ceremony, only the practiced movements of a man who had prepared for this moment long ago. The safe opened. Inside were thick folders, neatly aligned labels worn at the edges from being taken out and put back too many times. He placed the largest folder on the desk. The company name stood out clearly. Papers rustled as he flipped through them, each signature a slice of the past. Back then, when the company was on the verge of collapse, they had come to him desperate, pleading, promising anything. He had saved them not with kindness, but with a cold and fair deal. Control was there in black and white, undeniable. He sat down, back straight shoulders, relaxed. The feeling of being belittled drifted away, replaced by a plan neatly assembled in his mind. He picked up his phone and called his lawyer. No small talk, no emotion, just a list of demands. A full audit, executive spending, conflicts of interest, favoritism in contracts, everything. There was a brief pause on the other end of the line, then a calm question, asking if he was sure. He said it was time. His voice was low but firm. The call ended, and he knew the gears were already turning. His phone buzzed. A message from his wife, short, confused, edged with anger. He did not reply. Not to punish her, but because his answer no longer belonged in a text message. He stood, poured himself a glass of water, and looked at his reflection in the window. The man staring back had not changed on the outside. Not older, not taller. But his eyes were different. They no longer retreated or avoided. They belonged to someone who had accepted that silence is also a choice, and he had chosen silence long enough. The next morning, as the city woke up, the first emails went out. Polite, professional, and leaving no room for delay. The board was summoned. Reports were demanded. The people who had laughed the night before began checking the time more often, speaking in lower voices, taking calls behind closed doors. On another floor of the company, a young manager received a call from Human Resources. The reason was inappropriate conduct at an internal event. No one mentioned his name. They did not need to. The effect had already spread. Amid the messages and calls, his wife sat at her desk, fingers resting on the keyboard, unable to type a single word. She caught fragments of conversation, whispered rumors. An audit, an emergency meeting. His name spoken differently now. No longer as someone's husband, but as a name with weight. At home, he opened his laptop and reviewed the first streams of data. Numbers do not lie. Patterns emerged. Client dinners labeled as entertainment. contracts looping back to the same names. He did not feel angry. He simply took notes, underlined lines, marked pages. In the afternoon, another message came from his wife, longer this time, filled with explanations, justifications, apologies, tangled with confusion. He read it all, then placed the phone face down. Some conversations needed to happen, but not yet, and not the old way. He stood by the window watching traffic flow below. The world kept moving as usual, but for him, a new order had already been set, not for revenge, but to draw boundaries, to remind everyone that power does not always arrive with bright lights and loud laughter. Sometimes it sits quietly, observes, and waits for the right moment to step forward. The rest of the story would not unfold at a party. It would happen in boardrooms, in decisions, in the way he chose his next steps. And this time, he would no longer stand at the edge of his own story. The board meeting took place that afternoon, nearly a week earlier than scheduled. No one called it urgent, but everyone understood. When the gears of power start turning, no one wants to be the one standing still. He arrived early. No showmanship, no assistant at his side. Just a dark gray suit sharply tailored and a thin folder under his arm. When the boardroom doors opened, several quiet conversations stopped instantly. The faces around the long oak table were familiar. Some had raised their glasses and laughed the night before. Some had shaken his hand as if greeting someone not worth remembering. Others avoided his eyes altogether. The seat at the head of the table was still empty, the chief executive officer's chair. He did not sit. He remained standing, set the folder on the table, and let the attention settle on him naturally. He did not speak right away. He let the silence do the work. This silence was different from the one at the gala. There was no alcohol, no laughter. Only the steady hum of the air conditioning and the quiet pulse of people trying to calculate where they had misstepped. The door opened, and the chief executive officer walked in. The confidence he usually carried was gone. His steps were slower, his shoulders stiff. He stopped when he saw him standing there. In that instant, he understood. No introductions were needed, no confirmations required. Something in his eyes caused every last assumption to collapse. The meeting began. His voice was even neither raised nor softened, stripped of personal emotion. He spoke in numbers, irregular expenses, contracts approved too quickly, vendors whose names appeared far too often. He did not accuse. He asked questions, and every question came with documentation. One man cleared his throat. Another adjusted his glasses. A board member tried a nervous smile, as if this could still be smoothed over with familiar explanations. He turned the page. His tone did not change. The next question cut deeper, clearer, leaving no room for ambiguity. The chief executive officer spoke up, citing market pressure timing, difficult decisions that had to be made quickly. He listened, nodded, then placed the documents flat on the table and said the control belonged to him not as of today, but for 15 years he had simply chosen today to use it. No one objected. No one dared. In that moment, everyone understood a simple truth. They were not being attacked. They had been exposed. And in this world, that was far more frightening. Decisions followed quickly, suspensions, internal investigations, changes in signing authority. Legal language moved through the room like clean, precise cuts. The chief executive officer sat still, hands folded, eyes fixed on the table. When his name was mentioned for the last time as the responsible party, he did not react. He only let out a long breath, like someone who had reached the end of a road, without realizing when he had lost his way. When the meeting ended, he gathered his papers. No one stood before he did. A few nodded cautiously. A few avoided eye contact. He walked out of the room, the hallway brighter than he remembered, as if the light had always been there, and he had simply never stood in the right place to see it. Downstairs in an office washed in fluorescent light, his wife sat at her computer, reading the same email for the 10th time. His name appeared at the top without any family title. Not husband, not +1, but authority. Her throat went dry. Everything she thought she knew about the man she lived with began to fall apart, the pieces no longer fitting together. Her phone vibrated. A message from a coworker asking if she knew what was happening, asking if she was all right. She did not reply. For the first time, she realized her influence at this company was no longer a shield, and the only person who could give her answers was the man she had left, standing alone the night before. When he returned home that evening, the house was still. No familiar footsteps, no smell of dinner, only the living room light and an envelope waiting on the table. He did not open it immediately. He sat down, exhaled, not in relief, but in exhaustion, because he knew the hardest part had not yet begun. A company could be repaired with decisions and signatures. Power could be reclaimed through action. But a marriage was different. It does not collapse from a single sentence. It collapses from thousands of small moments when one person chooses silence and the other chooses to laugh along. He looked at the envelope on the table, knowing that once he opened it, nothing would remain on hold. And this time, whether in the boardroom or in his own home, he would not step back again. He opened the envelope once night had fully settled in. Inside was not legal paperwork, not a threat, and not a long apology. Just a few handwritten lines, the ink slightly uneven, as if the writer had paused many times while writing. She said she needed time, that everything had happened too fast, that she had not realized he had been carrying that weight alone for so long. He read it all, folded the paper, and set it down. There was no surge of anger, only a quiet emptiness opening up wide enough for him to finally see everything clearly. That night he did not sleep, not because he could not, but because he no longer wanted to avoid the thoughts he had pushed aside for years. He moved slowly through each room. Every object was familiar, but the feeling was not. The chair where she usually sat, answering emails. The counter where he cooked dinner. Habits built on silence and assumptions. He realized that for years he had done one thing very well. He had made himself easy to overlook. The next morning, as the first sunlight poured through the windows, he decided not to wait any longer. Not for her, not for the company, but for himself to change the way he stood in his own life. He put on a simple shirt, no tie, poured coffee, sat at his desk, opened his laptop. Not to read reports, but to write. He wrote down boundaries, not ultimatums, truths, about continuing to take direct control of operations, about new standards within the company, and about one final point more important than all the rest. In this marriage, he would no longer accept being treated as a safe option or a convenient background for someone else's image. When he arrived at headquarters, the atmosphere had changed. Not loud, not tense, but intentionally quiet. Eyes no longer slid past him. They lingered. People stood straighter, spoke more softly. Those who once spoke over others now waited their turn. Power did not need to knock. It was felt. He met with each department. No speeches, no threats, just questions. What they were doing, why, and what was stopping them from doing better. For the first time in years, people answered honestly. Some admitted fear. Some admitted they had stayed silent because they believed no one was listening. He acknowledged them. He did not make empty promises. But he made one thing clear. Those who worked with integrity would be protected, and those who relied on connections would have to adjust. On another floor, she sat in a small meeting room with two close colleagues. They whispered. They guessed. They tried to piece together the quiet husband she thought she knew with the decisions now shaking the company. She listened, but did not join in. Every explanation she had once used about him now stood facing her. She began to understand that the most painful part was not that he had hidden who he was, but that she had grown comfortable not needing to know. That afternoon, a message came from her. No accusations, no justifications. Just a question, asking if they could talk that evening. He stared at the words for a long moment, then replied, "Yes." Not to argue, but to tell the truth wherever it might lead. When he returned home, she was already there. No makeup, no careful styling. Just the woman he had once fallen in love with, standing in the living room with her hands clasped together. She spoke first. She said she had grown used to being respected out there, and had unconsciously carried that confidence home. That she had not noticed when confidence turned into disregard. That she had laughed because she thought it was the easiest way to keep the peace, not because she wanted to hurt him. He listened. He did not interrupt. He did not defend himself. When she finished, the room fell quiet. Not heavy, but exposed. He said he did not need to be admired. He only needed her to stand on the same side. When the whole world laughs, all it takes is one person who does not laugh along. And that night, she had failed to be that person. She cried. Not dramatically, just quietly. He did not comfort her. Not out of cruelty, but because he knew this was not the moment to soften the truth. This was the moment to let it remain long enough for both of them to understand it. When night fell, they sat on the sofa with a small space between them, not touching, not turning away. A new distance, unfamiliar, but necessary. He did not know where this marriage would go, but he knew one thing with certainty. He would never return to his old place, not in the company, and not in his own heart. That night passed slowly, without arguments, without promises. Just two people existing in the same familiar space that had completely changed. Near dawn, he was the one who woke up first. Not because he could not sleep, but because his mind no longer had room for avoidance. He stood by the window watching the streetlights fade, feeling strangely calm. For the first time in many years, he no longer felt the need to prove anything to anyone. In the other room, she lay facing the wall, eyes wide open. All night the same images replayed in her mind. Her own laughter at the dinner, the look in his eyes as the entire room mocked him, the way he stood up calm, not angry, not defensive. She suddenly realized that what frightened her most was not his power, but the fact that he no longer needed her validation. In the morning they ate breakfast in silence, not awkward, not intimate. He made coffee and placed the cup in front of her out of old habit. But this time, the gesture did not carry the meaning of quiet sacrifice. It felt like a silent period ending. She looked at the coffee, then at him, as if wanting to say something, but in the end, she stayed quiet. When he left the house, she stood at the door, watching him go. No pulling him back, no calling his name, just standing there, feeling as though she was watching a completely different man, even though the face was painfully familiar. At the office, the atmosphere had clearly shifted. Conversations fell silent when he passed. The looks that once slid past him now lingered cautious, respectful, even fearful. But he did not care. Power to him now was not about making others bow, but about changing how things worked. He began the day with a small meeting, no nameplates, no ceremony. Just people who had been overlooked, people who actually did the work sitting around a simple table. He asked them one question: if you had the power to decide, what would you fix first? The room went quiet for a few seconds. Then one by one they began to speak. Not in political language, but with honesty that had been suppressed for too long. Meanwhile, on another floor, she sat in her office unable to focus. Emails kept coming, but her eyes could not process the words. She heard his name mentioned in the hallway, in meeting rooms, in unfinished sentences. For the first time, she wasn't the center of those whispers, and that emptiness felt worse than humiliation. At noon, she received a message from him. It was not long, not cold, just a note saying he would be home late. No explanation, no permission. She read the line over and over, feeling an invisible boundary being drawn. Before he always asked. Today, he simply informed. As afternoon fell, a major decision was signed. Quietly. No announcements, but enough to shake the entire structure. Positions once considered untouchable began to wobble. Names that had laughed loudly at that dinner now grew unusually silent. He felt no satisfaction, only a sense of rightness. When he returned home, it was already dark. The living room light was on. She was sitting there, no makeup, no work clothes, just a person stripped bare with thoughts she could not yet organize. He set his bag down, looked at her, and for the first time that day, spoke first. He said he did not want to win this marriage. He only wanted the truth. That from now on, he would no longer make himself smaller, so others could feel bigger. If she wanted to stay, she had to stay with the real him, not the convenient, quiet version. If not, he was ready to let her go without resentment. She listened, tears falling, but no longer the tears of a victim. They were the tears of someone finally seeing her own role in the fracture. That night they did not hold each other, but they did not turn away either. Between them was a fragile distance not of separation, but of choice, and they both understood that from this moment on, nothing would ever return to how it was. But perhaps that was not a loss. Perhaps it was a beginning. The days that followed moved like an underground current, quiet but heavy with pressure. On the surface, everything still functioned normally. She went to work on time, he left the house early, and came home late. But inside that house, every wall seemed to be listening, every empty space carried questions without answers. At the company, he was no longer a name hidden behind the scenes. Meetings began to change their rhythm. There were no more long speeches masking irresponsibility, no more nods of agreement, just to avoid conflict. He appeared without showmanship, yet every decision was sharp and decisive. People slowly understood that his former silence was not a lack of ability, but a choice to step back. She felt it clearly. In meetings when eyes passed over her, it was no longer just the familiar admiration. There was something else now, a quiet scrutiny, an unspoken question. How could she not know? How could a wife be so unaware? Each glance felt like a silent accusation. That afternoon, she was called into an unexpected meeting. No prior schedule, no explanation. She stepped into the room, her heart beating faster than usual, and then she saw him seated at the head of the table, calm documents neatly arranged before him. He did not look at her, yet his presence made the room feel smaller. The meeting moved quickly. Numbers reports, strategic changes were laid out plainly, without detours or avoidance. When it was her turn to speak, her voice faltered slightly, even though her points were clear. She realized something painful. For the first time, she was no longer certain she held the strongest voice in the room. After the meeting, people filed out one by one. She deliberately stayed behind, organizing her papers more slowly than necessary. When the door closed, only the two of them remained. The silence was so complete, she could hear the steady hum of the air conditioning. She spoke first not in the voice of a corporate leader, but as a wife, struggling to remain composed. She asked whether all of this was an act of revenge. He looked up at her, his eyes not cold, but no longer gentle either. He said no. If this were revenge, it would have been far louder. This was simply about putting things back where they belonged, about what should have been seen long ago. She fell silent. In that moment, she understood that he no longer needed to prove anything. His calm did not come from victory, but from freeing himself of the need for validation. That evening, they sat across from each other in the living room again. No television, no phones, just the warm yellow light casting long shadows on the floor. She finally said the things she had held inside for years, that she had grown used to being seen as the more successful one, that she had unconsciously shaped his image in a way that made her feel safer in a competitive world. He listened without interrupting or arguing. When she finished, he asked one gentle question, whether in all those years she had ever wondered how he felt. The question was not an accusation, but it broke her. She cried not out of self-pity, but because for the first time she saw their marriage from another angle. Not a story about who earned more, but about respect, slowly worn away. That night she did not sleep. She sat at the dining table staring at old photos on the wall, the early days when they were poor, hopeful, believing that being together was enough. She realized it was not success that changed them, but how she had allowed success to define the worth of the man beside her. In his study, he also stayed awake. He looked at unfinished plans, yet his thoughts drifted to the years behind him. He did not regret staying silent, but he knew that if there was any chance left, it could only exist if they both faced the truth without any protective layers. Dawn slowly appeared. A new day began, with no promise of ease, no guarantee of a happy ending, but at least they were finally standing in their true places. From there, they would have to choose not from fear of loss, but from the respect each of them deserved. Everything did not change with a dramatic collapse. It began with a very small shift, almost invisible, yet strong enough to bend the entire trajectory she had believed was solid and unshakable. That morning she woke earlier than usual. Not because of work, not because of an important meeting waiting for her, but because for the first time in many years she felt afraid to place her feet on the floor, afraid to step out of the bedroom, afraid to face herself in the role of a wife who had missed too many clear signs for far too long. He had left the house very early. No noise, no familiar reminders. On the dining table lay only a small note placed neatly beside the cup she always used in the morning. It was not long. It was not heavy. Just a few lines reminding her to eat breakfast and saying he would be home late. No explanation, no emotion. That calmness shook her more violently than any argument they had ever had. This silence was no longer avoidance. It was a new boundary, clearly and deliberately being drawn. At the office, the changes continued to spread in a way that was difficult to name. She realized she was no longer the first person invited into strategic meetings. No one openly pushed her aside. No one directly challenged her position. But she was no longer the default center. Important decisions were made faster, cleaner, without the familiar displays of power she had once mastered. And within all those movements, his presence became increasingly visible, not through rumors, but through concrete actions decisive and controlled, without any need for spectacle. One afternoon, she received a notice to hand over a major project, a project that in the past no one would dare touch without her approval. This time the decision came from a higher level. No debate, no negotiation. She signed her name, her hand trembling slightly, not because of losing power, but because for the first time she understood what it felt like to be underestimated, overlooked, replaced without anyone feeling the need to explain. A feeling she had never imagined she would experience. She went home early that day. Sitting alone in the living room, the afternoon light slanted across familiar objects. The house was the same, every corner unchanged, yet the feeling was different. Things that once symbolized stability now felt hollow, and for the first time she realized that for years she had grown used to him, always being there, always stepping back, always ready to let her shine. Only when he stopped doing that did she understand how deeply she had relied on his retreat. That evening he came home later than usual, not tired, not tense, just quiet. She watched him as if trying to memorize every small movement, every silence between them. She asked softly whether he still believed in their marriage. He did not answer immediately. He sat down across from her, his gaze steady, neither avoiding nor softening. He said trust was not something that disappeared overnight. It wore down through every moment of being ignored, every time not being defended, every laugh that landed in the wrong place without anyone standing up for you. He said the most painful thing was not being disrespected by outsiders, but being diminished by the person you love. She listened. She did not argue. For the first time, she did not try to justify her actions. She only asked whether she still had a chance to make things right. He said a chance was not something to beg for. It was something to prove through time, through choices, through how one treats another person when there is nothing left to gain. In the days that followed, she began to change quietly. No declarations, no loud apologies. In meetings, she listened more than she spoke. She defended junior employees when they were unfairly attacked. She refused jokes aimed at others. Every small action felt like an attempt at redemption, not to earn forgiveness, but to become someone different, someone she herself was learning again from the beginning. He noticed the change, but he did not rush. He had learned that promises made too quickly often disappeared just as fast. He observed keeping the necessary distance, not cold, but no longer returning to the role of someone who always stepped back. One late evening, as they sat in silence in the living room, she said that for the first time in her life, she was no longer certain about herself, and that very uncertainty forced her to re-examine everything she had once taken for granted. He did not comfort her. He simply said that sometimes losing certainty was the only way to find the truth. The distance between them still existed, but it was no longer the distance of unspoken wounds. It was the distance of two people learning to stand on equal ground, no one ahead, no one behind. And although the road ahead was unclear, they both understood that if they continued together, it would be on the foundation of respect, not habit. The story did not settle with a promise, but with another silence. A silence that was no longer heavy, but necessary. Like a deep breath before a real choice is finally made, a choice that would determine whether they move forward together or walk in separate directions. Part 8 opens with a very small shift, almost invisible, yet strong enough to bend the entire course she once believed was unshakable. That morning she woke earlier than usual, not because of work, not because of an important meeting, but because for the first time in many years, she felt afraid to place her feet on the floor, afraid to step out of the bedroom and face herself in the role of a wife who had missed far too many obvious signs. He had left the house early. On the dining table lay a small note neatly placed beside the cup she always used. It was not long, not heavy. Just a few lines reminding her to eat breakfast and saying he would be home late. No explanation, no emotion. That calmness shook her more deeply than any argument they had ever had. This silence was not an escape. It was a new boundary being drawn. At the company, the atmosphere continued to change in a way that was hard to name. She realized she was no longer the first person invited into strategic meetings. No one openly pushed her aside, but she was no longer the default center. Important decisions were made faster, cleaner, without the familiar displays of authority. And in the middle of all those changes, his name appeared more and more, not in rumors, but in concrete actions, decisive and unshowy. One afternoon, she received a notice to hand over a major project, one that no one had ever touched without her approval. This time the decision came from a higher level. No debate, no negotiation. She signed her hand trembling slightly, not because she was losing power, but because for the first time she understood what it felt like to be underestimated, overlooked, replaced without anyone feeling the need to explain. She went home early that day and sat alone in the living room as afternoon light slanted across familiar objects. The house was the same, yet it felt different. Things that once symbolized stability now felt hollow. She realized that for years she had grown used to him, always being there, always stepping back, always making room for her to shine. Only when he stopped doing that did she understand how much she had relied on his retreat. That evening he came home later than usual, not exhausted, not tense, just quiet. She watched him as if trying to memorize every small movement, every pause between them. She asked softly whether he still believed in their marriage. He did not answer immediately. He sat down across from her, his gaze steady, neither avoiding nor softening. He said trust does not disappear in a single night. It wears down with every time it is ignored, every time it is not defended, every laugh that rings out in the wrong place with no one standing beside you. He said the most painful thing is not being looked down on by outsiders, but being diminished by the person you love. She listened without arguing. For the first time, she did not try to justify herself. She only asked whether she still had a chance to make things right. He said chances are not something you ask for. They are something you prove through time, through choices, through how you treat someone when there is nothing left to gain. In the days that followed, she began to change quietly. No announcements, no dramatic apologies. In meetings, she listened more than she spoke. She defended junior employees when they were unfairly attacked. She refused jokes aimed at tearing others down. Each small act felt like an attempt at atonement, not to be forgiven, but to become someone else, someone she herself was relearning from the beginning. He noticed the change, but he did not rush. He had learned that promises made too quickly often faded just as fast. He observed, kept the necessary distance, not cold, but no longer stepping back into his old role. One late evening, as they sat in silence in the living room, she admitted that for the first time in her life, she was no longer certain of herself, and that uncertainty forced her to question everything she had once taken for granted. He did not comfort her. He only said that sometimes losing certainty is the only way to find the truth. The distance between them was still there, but it was no longer the distance of unspoken wounds. It was the distance of two people learning to stand on equal ground, with no one ahead and no one behind. And though the road ahead was unclear, they both understood that if they continued together, it would be built on respect, not habit. Part 8 closes not with a promise, but with another silence, one that is no longer heavy, but a necessary pause before a real choice is finally made. The morning began with a short message, cold and precise, like a surgeon's blade. The board meeting had been moved up earlier than planned. No explanation, no symbols, just a time and a location. He read it, set the phone down, and noticed his heartbeat did not rise at all. What once tightened his chest years ago now felt like nothing more than a step to take. She stood at the kitchen doorway, quietly watching him tie his shoes. She did not ask. She did not interfere. In her eyes was something new, a mix of fear and respect. She understood then that real power does not need to be fought for. It clears its own path when the one who holds it stops asking for permission. At headquarters, the air felt dense. Hallways that were once loud now echoed with every footstep. Executives took their seats earlier than usual, flipping through documents as if paper could help them escape reality. When he entered, the room fell silent, not out of fear, but because awareness had arrived too late. He did not open with a speech. He placed the folder on the table, each page carefully arranged. The numbers spoke for themselves, no long explanations needed. Distorted cash flow. Decisions delayed for personal gain. The familiar laughter from that company dinner had turned into lowered heads and avoided eyes. He spoke slowly, clearly, in short sentences. He did not accuse. He stated facts. Facts heavy enough that no one could deny them. Some asked for more time. Others blamed circumstances. He listened, nodded, then said time had already been given more than enough. What was missing was not opportunity, but accountability. He announced a series of changes, a restructuring of operations, transparent processes, leadership evaluations based on results, not relationships. Each decision landed on the table like a seal, locking in a new future. At the far end, she sat silently. Her name was not called. She was not questioned. But she knew this was the moment everything was being reshaped. She looked at him no longer, the husband who stood quietly at company dinners, but a man standing firm in a room full of power. She realized his lack of display had never been weakness, but a choice to place family above the spotlight. The meeting ended quickly. No one lingered for polite conversation. Handshakes were serious weighted. As people left, he gathered his papers without hurry. She stood and walked toward him. This time she did not ask for anything. She only said she understood, and that she was willing to learn again from the beginning, not a position, but how to stand beside him. He looked at her, his gaze steady, not harsh, but unyielding. He said standing beside someone does not mean standing behind or ahead. It means standing on the same side when things become difficult. It means knowing when to be silent and when to speak. It means not laughing when the person you love is being diminished. She nodded, accepting without argument. That afternoon he visited a rarely used floor, a small room filled with natural light. On the walls were plans and sketches for a new initiative, a fund to support young employees with talent but little opportunity. He signed his name with a firm hand. This was not retaliation. This was direction. Lasting change does not come from punishment, but from building. The news spread quickly inside the company, not loudly in the media, but enough to create a wave. Those who had stayed silent began to speak. Those who had been overlooked began to be heard. She saw it in colleagues' eyes, in the way conversations became more honest, more humane. For the first time, she understood that power can heal when used correctly. That evening they went home together. No holding hands, no distance, a new balance. She cooked a simple dinner. He set the table. Small actions without performance. When they sat down, they did not talk about work. They talked about ordinary things, and that ordinary calm was the hardest thing to rebuild. The story closed on a quiet image. 2 cups placed side by side on the kitchen table, steam rising slowly. No promises, no victory. Just a new path opening where respect was no longer assumed, but chosen again each day. The night before the final meeting, he did not sleep much. Not from anxiety, but because fragments of old memories kept resurfacing evenings when he had sat quietly in the corner of a room, moments when he was introduced with a polite smile, like an unimportant detail in a larger picture. Now, with power fully revealed, he understood that the hardest part was not standing up, but making sure he did not become a version of the very people who once forced him into silence. The next morning, a light rain fell. Droplets tapped against the car window in a steady rhythm, a reminder that every decision made today would leave a lasting mark. She sat beside him, silent, no questions, no advice, just a complete presence. The distance between them had changed. It was no longer tense, but not yet peaceful. It felt like a bridge under construction, built piece by piece, needing time before it could carry weight. The meeting began on time. The large room was lit by cold white lights, familiar faces now wearing different expressions. There was no arrogance, no laughter, only anticipation. He walked in, set down his briefcase, and looked around once. He did not take the head of the table. He chose a seat on equal ground, a quiet declaration of how he intended to lead from now on. He spoke about vision, not empty slogans, but clear principles. Respect for people before profit, transparency before power, responsibility before reputation. He acknowledged the mistakes that had been made, without blame, and without avoidance. He emphasized that the changes were not about revenge, but about repairing a system that had grown accustomed to disregarding its core values. Questions were raised about control, about risk, about whether he was going too far. He answered calmly. Control was not for display, but for protection. The greatest risk was not change, but continuing as before, and if anything had gone too far, it was the long silence of those who knew something was wrong, but chose not to speak. She listened, feeling that every word was not only strategy, but a delayed confession. She realized that all those years, his silence had not been weakness, but faith that love would be enough. Now he understood that love cannot survive without respect. The meeting ended with a crucial decision. An independent committee was formed to oversee the changes, ensuring that no one, including him, stood above shared principles. When it came time to vote, hands rose without hesitation. Not out of fear, but because for the first time, they saw a direction they could trust. On the way home, the rain had stopped. The city appeared clearer, as if freshly washed. She turned to him and said she once believed power was what allowed people to stand above others. Now she understood that real power forces you to bow your head and face the consequences of your choices. He smiled softly, not in victory, but in quiet understanding. That evening they sat together in the familiar room. They did not talk about work. They did not reopen the past. They were simply two people learning how to be fully present. He said the road ahead would not be easy. There would be resistance. There would be new mistakes. But this time, he would not walk alone. She nodded, offering no grand promises. She only said she would never laugh again when he was being diminished, and she would never stay silent when it happened to anyone else. This part closed with a feeling both unfamiliar and real. Not complete happiness, not an ending, but a moment where both understood that true change does not lie in who holds power, but in who they choose to become once power is in their hands. The final morning arrived quietly, almost too ordinary compared to everything that had unfolded. He woke as sunlight slipped through the curtains and spread across the familiar room. There was no heaviness in his chest anymore, no urge to prove anything, only the steady calm of someone who had accepted himself both past and present. She stood by the window making coffee, her movements slow and deliberate. Between them there were no grand words, no dramatic promises, but something had changed. The way she looked at him was no longer shaped by pride in power, but by recognition of who he had always been, even when no one else saw it. At the company, the changes began to take root. Mocking laughter faded. Decisions were no longer made behind closed doors. Employees worked with a sense of safety and trust. Those once overlooked now had room to rise on real ability. He no longer needed to appear in every meeting. His authority no longer lived in presence, but in the system he had built. One afternoon he stood alone in his office, gazing at the city stretching below. His thoughts returned to that company dinner where laughter tried to define him as a failure. He realized that if he had lashed out in anger that night, if he had chosen bitterness instead of restraint, everything would have followed a different path. But he had chosen silence, then chosen to stand at the right moment, not to destroy, but to build. She joined him standing at his side. No questions, no explanations. They stood parallel, neither above nor below the other. A new balance, fragile yet real. She said she had learned a painful lesson that respect does not come from position, but from how we treat the person beside us when no one else is watching. He nodded. It was the same truth he had learned the hard way. That evening they went home early. The kitchen lights glowed warm. The sound of a knife on the cutting board, the familiar scent of food. Small things once ignored now became the foundation for everything else. They did not know what the future would bring, but this time they stepped into it with open eyes, without illusion, without taking each other for granted. The story did not end with victory, but with a choice. A choice to respect. A choice not to stay silent when the one you love is diminished. A choice to stand in the right place, not for ego, but for values. And if there was one truth to remember, it was this: the most underestimated person in the room is often the one with the greatest power, not to tear things down, but to change everything. If this story resonated with you, take a moment to ask yourself a simple question. How many times have we stayed silent when we should have spoken up for ourselves or for someone we love? Power does not always look loud. Sometimes it looks like patience, restraint, and the courage to stand up at the right moment. Stories like this remind us that respect is not given by titles, money, or status. It is earned through actions, consistency, and the choices we make when no one is watching. If you believe stories can change perspectives, inspire growth, and spark meaningful conversations, then you are in the right place. Share your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever been underestimated or seen someone quietly prove everyone wrong? Your experience might help someone else feel less alone. If you enjoyed this story, please like the video and subscribe for more powerful emotional storytelling. New stories are coming, stories of resilience, betrayal, redemption, and the strength it takes to reclaim your worth. Stay with us, because sometimes the quietest voices carry the strongest truths.